In the early days of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots ruled the skies with speed, precision, and deadly experience. American aviators paid the price. But then a new fighter arrived on carrier decks across the ocean, heavier, faster in a dive, built not just to fight, but to survive. The Grumman F6F Hellcat didn't just enter combat, it rewrote the balance of power above the Pacific. From its first clashes to the largest carrier battles ever fought, it faced veteran aces, massed formations, and even suicide attackers. This is the story of 7 moments when the Hellcat didn't just compete in the air, it overwhelmed it. The first shock. Hellcats over Marcus Island, 1943. By mid-1943, the balance of air power in the Pacific was shifting, but not yet decisively. For nearly 2 years, Japanese carrier fighters, particularly the agile A6M0, had dominated early war engagements with a lethal mix of maneuverability and experienced pilots. American naval aviation had adapted, improved tactics, and introduced tougher aircraft. Yet, there remained a lingering question inside the U.S. Navy. Would the new fighter truly reverse the equation in direct confrontation? That answer began to form in the skies over Marcus Island during an August 1943 carrier raid. The aircraft leading that test was the Grumman F6F Hellcat, freshly deployed to frontline squadrons and carrying expectations that extended well beyond its aluminum skin. The Hellcat was not designed to outturn the Zero in a traditional dogfight. Engineers at Grumman had drawn a different set of conclusions from early Pacific losses. Survivability mattered. Speed in a dive mattered. Firepower concentration mattered. The Hellcat carried 6.50 caliber machine guns, substantial armor protection, and a powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine that gave it impressive acceleration and climb performance. It was heavier than its Japanese counterpart, but it was built to absorb punishment and return fire decisively. When U.S. carriers launched strikes against Marcus Island, Japanese defenders responded quickly. Radar networks were limited compared to what would later develop, so interception relied on visual spotting and rapid scramble. Japanese pilots climbing to engage expected to meet familiar American fighters such as the F4F Wildcat, which they had learned to counter through superior turning ability and coordinated tactics. Instead, they encountered something different. The first engagements over Marcus Island were not massive fleet battles, but sharp, high-altitude clashes. Hellcat pilots quickly discovered that the aircraft's performance envelope allowed them to dictate engagement geometry. Rather than turning tightly with Japanese fighters, they used altitude advantage and diving speed to execute boom and zoom attacks. A Hellcat would dive with momentum, unleash concentrated fire, and then climb away before a Zero could force a turning contest. The results were immediate and unsettling for the defenders. Japanese pilots found that attempts to close for a turning fight were often met with heavy firepower and resilience they had not previously faced. The Hellcat could absorb hits that might have crippled earlier American fighters, and its speed in a dive made pursuit risky. Reports from the raid indicated multiple Japanese aircraft shot down with comparatively light American losses. This did not mean the battle was effortless. Japanese pilots were still skilled, particularly those with combat experience from earlier campaigns. In several instances, Hellcats that allowed themselves to be drawn into horizontal turning fights faced real danger. The Zero retained superior low-speed maneuverability, and complacency could be fatal. Yet, the structural balance had shifted. American pilots were no longer fighting defensively. They were imposing tactical terms. The psychological impact of these first clashes was significant. For U.S. aviators, the Hellcat validated months of training adjustments and design philosophy changes. The aircraft's rugged construction reduced the fear that a single well-placed burst would lead to catastrophic loss. Confidence grew as pilots realized they could press attacks aggressively without the same vulnerability that had characterized earlier encounters. For Japanese defenders, the shock was strategic as much as tactical. The assumption that American carrier fighters could be consistently outmaneuvered no longer held. The Hellcat's combination of speed, climb, and firepower narrowed the performance gap that had once favored Japan. Moreover, American production capacity meant that this was not an isolated prototype, but the beginning of large-scale deployment. The raid on Marcus Island did not decide the Pacific Air War. It did, however, mark a visible turning point. The first substantial combat test of the Hellcat demonstrated that technological adaptation, informed by hard lessons from earlier defeats, could recalibrate air superiority. What had begun as an experiment in aircraft design was now a practical reality in contested skies. Over the Pacific, the introduction of the Hellcat signaled that Japanese pilots would increasingly face an opponent capable not only of surviving engagement, but of overwhelming them through calculated aggression. The shock over Marcus Island was not merely about aircraft lost. It was about the recognition that the balance of air power was beginning to tilt decisively in a new direction. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, air superiority at scale. By June 1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase where attrition favored the United States in both material and training depth, yet the outcome was not predetermined. When American forces advanced toward the Mariana Islands, the Japanese Navy understood the stakes. The Marianas placed U.S. bombers within range of the Japanese home islands, and Tokyo committed what remained of its carrier air power to stop the invasion. What followed during the Battle of the Philippine Sea would become one of the most lopsided aerial engagements in modern naval history. The centerpiece of American fighter strength that day was the Grumman F6F Hellcat. By mid-1944, the Hellcat was no longer new. It was battle-tested, deployed in large numbers, and flown by pilots trained under increasingly standardized and rigorous programs. Unlike earlier stages of the war, American aviators now entered combat with structured carrier qualifications, gunnery drills, and tactical doctrine refined through painful early war lessons. The engagement unfolded at scale. Japanese carrier aircraft launched in successive waves toward the American fleet, attempting to break through layered defenses and strike the invasion forces. However, this time they faced a radically different defensive architecture. Radar-equipped ships detected incoming formations at long range, allowing fighter direction officers to vector Hellcats into optimal interception positions. Instead of scrambling reactively, American fighters were positioned deliberately, often at altitude and with numerical advantage. The tactical imbalance became evident almost immediately. Japanese strike aircraft, including fighters and bombers, approached in formations that had once proven effective in earlier campaigns. Yet, many of the pilots flying those aircraft were no longer the seasoned veterans of 1941 and 1942. Attrition in previous battles had depleted Japan's cadre of highly trained aviators, and replacement training programs had been compressed due to fuel shortages and industrial strain. The result was a generation of pilots entering high-intensity combat, with fewer flight hours and less operational seasoning. Hellcat pilots exploited this disparity systematically. Rather than engaging in close, turning contests, they attacked from altitude, using superior dive speed and concentrated .50 caliber firepower. The Hellcat's rugged construction meant that even when Japanese aircraft returned fire, American fighters were more likely to survive damage. Dive attacks shattered incoming formations before they could organize for coordinated strikes. In many cases, Japanese aircraft were shot down before they even sighted the American fleet. The scale of destruction was unprecedented. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft encountered radar-directed interception and disciplined fighter tactics. American pilots described targets appearing almost continuously, a grim reversal of earlier Pacific engagements when they had faced overwhelming odds. The term "turkey shoot," though informal, captured the perception of imbalance felt by many participants. Japanese losses mounted rapidly, while American fighter losses remained comparatively low. However, describing the battle purely as a mismatch oversimplifies the structural realities behind it. The lopsided outcome reflected more than just aircraft performance. It revealed the cumulative effect of industrial production, pilot training pipelines, radar integration, and doctrinal evolution. The Hellcat was the instrument, but the system supporting it amplified its effectiveness. Carrier task forces operated as coordinated networks, not isolated decks launching fighters blindly into contested airspace. For Japan, the consequences were severe and immediate. The loss of so many carrier-qualified pilots in a single engagement proved irreplaceable. Aircraft could be manufactured, but experienced aviators required time and resources that Japan no longer possessed in abundance. The defeat at the Philippine Sea marked a strategic rupture in Japanese naval aviation capability, limiting its ability to contest American advances in subsequent campaigns. For American forces, the battle demonstrated air superiority not as a fragile advantage, but as an operational norm. Hellcat squadrons had transitioned from defensive survival to dominance at scale. The skies over the Marianas no longer represented uncertain battlegrounds. They reflected an asymmetry that would persist through the remainder of the Pacific War. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot was not merely a dramatic day of aerial combat. It was a statistical and strategic turning point where technological design, training infrastructure, and tactical control converged to produce overwhelming results. Air superiority was no longer contested in equal terms. It had become systemic, breaking the carrier shield, Hellcats versus veteran aces. Not every engagement in the Pacific was a statistical imbalance. Before the overwhelming attrition of 1944 thinned Japan's elite aviators, there remained pockets of highly experienced carrier pilots who had survived Coral Sea, Midway, and the brutal Solomons campaign. These men were not inexperienced replacements. They were disciplined, aggressive, and deeply familiar with the strengths of their aircraft. When the Grumman F6F Hellcat began appearing over contested waters, it was these veterans who first tested whether the new American fighter truly represented a decisive shift. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized coordinated maneuvering and close-in agility. The A6M0, lighter and exceptionally maneuverable at low speeds, rewarded pilots who could force opponents into turning engagements. Veteran aces understood how to bait adversaries into horizontal fights where the Zero's tighter turning radius provided advantage. Against earlier American fighters, this approach had yielded consistent results. The Hellcat altered that equation, but not automatically. In several early carrier clashes during 1943 and early 1944, Japanese aces attempted to draw Hellcats downward into slow-speed dogfights. The risk for American pilots was real. The Hellcat's weight, while contributing to durability and diving speed, limited its ability to sustain tight horizontal turns at low velocity. A pilot who ignored tactical guidance and attempted to outturn a Zero could quickly find himself at a disadvantage. However, U.S. Navy doctrine had evolved precisely to prevent such mistakes. Hellcat squadrons were trained to fight in pairs and divisions, maintaining altitude advantage whenever possible. Instead of engaging individually, pilots supported one another with coordinated attacks. When a Zero committed to a turn against one Hellcat, a wingman, often positioned above, could dive in with concentrated fire. The combination of teamwork and firepower began to erode the effectiveness of even experienced Japanese pilots. The Hellcat's structural resilience further complicated Japanese tactics. Veteran aces who scored hits sometimes found that their opponent did not immediately disintegrate or lose control. Armor protection around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks allowed American fighters to absorb damage that earlier aircraft might not have survived. A Zero pilot expecting a decisive outcome from a well-placed burst occasionally faced a counterattack instead. Engagement geometry became the defining factor. Hellcat pilots leveraged climb performance and dive acceleration to control distance. Rather than matching maneuver for maneuver, they dictated when and how combat unfolded. High-speed slashing attacks minimized exposure while maximizing the impact of 6.50 caliber machine guns firing in unison. Against even the most skilled adversary, repeated vertical attacks imposed cumulative pressure. There were still costly encounters. Japanese aces did not vanish overnight, and some Hellcat pilots paid the price for underestimating them. Reports from carrier operations in the Central Pacific describe moments when individual skill overcame numerical disadvantage. A veteran Zero pilot who maintained energy discipline could exploit overconfidence or separation within American formations. Air combat remained lethal and unforgiving, regardless of technological trends. Yet, as engagements multiplied, a pattern emerged. The Hellcat's design philosophy emphasized survivability and sustained offensive capability rather than extreme maneuverability. In repeated clashes, that philosophy proved sustainable. Veteran Japanese pilots faced a new reality. Even when they achieved temporary positional advantage, they were contending with an aircraft that could dive away, regroup, and re-engage under more favorable conditions. The psychological dimension of these duels mattered as well. Early in the war, Japanese naval aviators operated with a sense of qualitative superiority reinforced by combat success. By the time Hellcats were breaking through carrier shields, that confidence had been tested repeatedly. Facing opponents who no longer appeared tactically inferior introduced uncertainty into engagements that once felt predictable. Breaking the carrier shield was therefore not a single battle, but a series of confrontations where design, doctrine, and discipline intersected with individual expertise. The Hellcat did not eliminate the threat posed by veteran aces instantly, but it narrowed their margin for dominance. As attrition continued and replacements struggled to match earlier training standards, even the most experienced Japanese pilots found themselves confronting an opponent built not merely to survive combat, but to outlast and outgun them over time, intercepting the kamikaze threat, killing the attackers before impact. By late 1944, the air war in the Pacific had taken on a darker dimension. Japan's naval aviation arm, battered by attrition and depleted of experienced carrier pilots, shifted toward a tactic born of desperation rather than doctrine. Instead of attempting to win air superiority outright, special attack units were formed with a single objective: penetrate American defenses and deliberately crash into ships. The kamikaze campaign transformed aerial combat from a contest of maneuver and survival into a race against time. For the Grumman F6F Hellcat, this new threat demanded a change in mindset. Traditional dogfighting principles assumed that both pilots sought survival and positional advantage. Kamikaze attackers did not break off when damaged. They did not disengage when outnumbered. Their objective was not air victory but impact. That altered the geometry of interception entirely. Carrier task forces responded by constructing layered defensive screens. Radar picket ships extended detection range, identifying incoming aircraft well before visual contact. Fighter direction officers coordinated intercept vectors, launching Hellcats to meet inbound raids at distance. The goal was simple in theory: destroy attackers as far from the fleet as possible. In practice, each incoming formation represented a compressed timeline, where seconds determined whether a bomb-laden aircraft would be reduced to debris or become a flaming projectile aimed at a flight deck. Hellcat pilots faced an operational paradox. A kamikaze aircraft, even if damaged, could remain lethal. Shooting down an attacker too close to the fleet risked debris or fuel-igniting ships below. Allowing it to approach unchallenged was worse. Pilots therefore prioritized high-speed interceptions that maximized destruction before terminal dive phase. Concentrated bursts from 6.50 caliber machine guns were aimed at engines and cockpit areas to disable control quickly. Precision mattered because a wounded aircraft could still complete its dive under momentum. The psychological strain of these missions differed sharply from earlier engagements against conventional Japanese fighters. In previous battles, forcing an enemy into retreat signaled success. Against kamikaze pilots, retreat was irrelevant. Even an aircraft trailing smoke could abruptly roll into a dive toward the nearest ship. Hellcat aviators learned to pursue aggressively until visual confirmation of destruction. Partial damage was insufficient. The target had to be rendered incapable of controlled flight. The scale of attacks intensified during operations such as the Battle of Leyte Gulf and later the Battle of Okinawa. Waves of special attack aircraft approached from multiple bearings, sometimes coordinated with conventional fighters attempting to distract American defenses. Hellcat squadrons found themselves stretched across wide sectors, intercepting scattered formations rather than a single organized strike. Fuel management and ammunition conservation became critical as pilots engaged successive threats without clear pause. Technologically, the Hellcat retained advantages that proved decisive. Its rugged construction allowed pilots to dive steeply and recover without structural compromise, enabling rapid repositioning between targets. Its firepower delivered destructive capability in short engagement windows. Most importantly, radar-directed interception provided situational awareness that Japanese attackers lacked. American fighters were often waiting at altitude before the first visual sighting occurred. Despite these advantages, kamikaze strikes still inflicted damage. No defensive screen was impenetrable. Weather conditions, low-altitude approaches, and saturation tactics occasionally allowed attackers to slip through. Each successful impact underscored the limits of even robust fighter defense. Hellcat pilots understood that their mission was not abstract air superiority, but the protection of ships crowded with sailors and Marines. Intercepting kamikaze aircraft required disciplined aggression, rather than pursuit of aerial victory. The objective was denial, not dominance. Success was measured in ships that remained afloat and decks that remained operational. The Hellcat's role evolved from crushing enemy fighters in maneuver combat to eliminating airborne threats before they could convert altitude and speed into suicide trajectories. In that phase of the war, air combat became brutally pragmatic. There were no duels of skill once a kamikaze committed to its dive. There was only interception distance, ammunition remaining, and the narrow window before impact. The Hellcat's contribution lay in widening that window just enough to tip outcomes in favor of survival for the fleet below. Night fighters. Over the Pacific, radar, darkness, and deadly ambushes. Darkness had favored Japan early in the Pacific War. Night harassment raids, low visibility reconnaissance, and sporadic bomber attacks exploited limited Allied radar integration and uneven night flying training. A single aircraft slipping through at dusk could disrupt sleep cycles aboard carriers or force ships into defensive maneuvers that strained already complex operations. By 1944, however, the night sky was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a hunting ground. The transformation hinged on technology and adaptation. The night fighter variant of the Grumman F6F Hellcat, designated the F6F-5N, carried airborne interception radar mounted in a wing pod. This addition changed not just equipment loadout, but tactical doctrine. Instead of relying solely on visual acquisition or searchlights, pilots could track targets beyond line of sight, guided by electronic returns rather than moonlight silhouettes. Operating a radar-equipped Hellcat demanded specialized training. The cockpit at night was an environment of controlled disorientation. External reference points vanished once the carrier's lights disappeared behind the horizon. Pilots learned to trust instruments while simultaneously interpreting radar scopes that displayed abstract blips rather than recognizable aircraft shapes. Coordination between pilot and radar operator, when two-seat arrangements were available in other aircraft types, was replaced in the single-seat Hellcat by multitasking under pressure. Flying, navigating, and intercepting converged into a single cognitive load. Japanese night operations, though less frequent than daytime carrier battles, posed strategic annoyance and occasional danger. Twin-engine bombers conducted harassment runs intended to disrupt fleet assembly areas or newly captured island airfields. Without interception, these aircraft could drop bombs with limited resistance. Traditional anti-aircraft fire, reliant on visual spotting, proved unreliable in total darkness or cloud cover. Radar-directed fighters offered a proactive alternative. The intercept sequence at night differed markedly from daylight combat. Ground or ship-based radar first detected inbound aircraft at long range. Fighter direction officers then vectored Hellcats toward projected intercept points. Once airborne, the pilot transitioned to onboard radar for terminal tracking. Instead of scanning the sky for glints of sunlight on wings, the pilot monitored a scope for increasing signal strength. Distance closed invisibly until the target was within visual range, often revealed only by faint exhaust glow or silhouette against starlight. Ambush replaced maneuver contest. Japanese crews flying night missions did not expect aggressive interception at altitude. Many were accustomed to limited opposition beyond flak bursts. When a Hellcat emerged from darkness, firing a concentrated burst into engine nacelles or fuselage, the engagement could conclude before the target crew registered the threat. The element of surprise inverted earlier patterns, where Allied forces had reacted defensively to night harassment. Yet night fighting introduced its own hazards. Spatial disorientation could be fatal, particularly over open ocean where horizon lines were indistinct. A pilot focused too intently on radar could drift into unsafe flight attitudes. Recovering from steep dives or banking turns without visual cues demanded disciplined instrument scanning. Additionally, target identification was complicated by the risk of friendly aircraft operating in the same sectors. Strict identification protocols were necessary to avoid fratricide in low visibility conditions. The F6F5N's radar did not guarantee flawless detection. Sea clutter, weather interference, and equipment limitations occasionally obscured returns. Pilots had to interpret imperfect data, deciding whether a faint signal represented a hostile aircraft or atmospheric distortion. Missed intercepts occurred, and not every night raid was neutralized. However, the broader trend shifted decisively. Japanese bombers increasingly encountered interception rather than uncontested approach. Strategically, night fighter operations reinforced the systemic advantage the United States had built by 1944. Radar integration across ships and aircraft created layered awareness extending beyond daylight hours. Air superiority ceased to be a condition confined to visible skies. It became continuous. The Hellcat's adaptation to radar warfare demonstrated that dominance was not solely about speed and firepower, but about controlling the information environment in which combat unfolded. Over the Pacific, darkness once concealed attackers. With radar-equipped Hellcats prowling beyond the carrier perimeter, it became another domain of calculated engagement. Deadly ambushes replaced surprise raids, and the night sky, like the day, increasingly belonged to those who could see without light. The battle for Leyte Gulf, overwhelming the last offensive. By October 1944, the Pacific War had narrowed into a contest over the Philippines. Control of these islands would sever Japan's access to vital oil supplies from Southeast Asia and fracture its defensive perimeter. For Tokyo, the stakes were existential. The response was bold, complex, and desperate. A massive naval counteroffensive aimed at destroying the American invasion fleet off Leyte. The confrontation that followed, known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, unfolded across multiple seas and involved one of the largest concentrations of naval power in history. Above that vast maritime battlefield, the Grumman F6F Hellcat played a decisive and relentless role. Unlike earlier carrier clashes where uncertainty defined the opening moves, American forces at Leyte operated with integrated radar networks, improved fighter direction, and hardened doctrine. Japanese naval aviation, by contrast, had been severely degraded in previous battles, yet it remained capable of concentrated effort. Carrier-based aircraft, land-based fighters, and special attack units were committed in waves intended to overwhelm American defenses through sheer persistence. Hellcat squadrons launched repeatedly from fleet carriers, cycling through combat air patrols that stretched from dawn to dusk. The tempo was exhausting. Pilots refueled, rearmed, and relaunched within hours, sometimes within minutes, responding to radar reports of incoming formations. The objective was no longer experimental air superiority. It was total denial of Japanese airspace above the fleet. Japanese strike packages approaching the American task forces encountered layered resistance. Long-range radar detection allowed Hellcats to intercept inbound aircraft well before visual contact with ships below. Dive attacks shattered formations attempting coordinated torpedo or bombing runs. The Hellcat's firepower proved devastating against bombers carrying ordnance, where a single concentrated burst could ignite fuel or detonate payloads mid-air. Despite declining pilot quality, Japanese forces retained pockets of discipline and aggression. Some formations pressed forward under heavy fire, determined to release weapons before destruction. Hellcat pilots often faced aircraft that did not break off when damaged, forcing close-range engagements that increased personal risk. In the chaos above Leyte Gulf, the distinction between interception and survival blurred. Proximity to exploding enemy aircraft posed its own hazards. The operational environment compounded complexity. Leyte Gulf was not a single-point engagement, but a sprawling theater stretching across hundreds of miles. American carrier groups maneuvered to counter multiple Japanese surface forces approaching from different directions. Hellcat pilots sometimes flew extended missions over unfamiliar waters, managing fuel carefully while awaiting updated vector instructions. Coordination between ships and aircraft required constant communication discipline to prevent confusion amid overlapping battles. Attrition on the Japanese side became severe. Aircraft losses mounted rapidly, and with them the diminishing pool of trained naval aviators. American reports from the engagement documented numerous aerial victories achieved with comparatively low fighter losses. However, describing the outcome purely in numerical terms obscures the operational strain endured by Hellcat squadrons. Continuous combat patrols, limited rest, and sustained alert status taxed both air crews and deck crews responsible for maintaining aircraft readiness. The broader strategic impact was profound. The failure of Japan's last major offensive attempt in the Philippines effectively crippled its ability to contest American naval dominance through conventional carrier warfare. Air cover that might have shielded retreating surface forces was instead fragmented and destroyed piecemeal. The Hellcat's contribution was not isolated dogfights, but the systematic dismantling of aerial support that Japanese ships required to survive. By the conclusion of the Leyte operations, American air superiority was no longer a contested aspiration, but an operational certainty in the region. The skies above the invasion fleet were defended aggressively and continuously. Japanese aircraft that penetrated the defensive screen did so at extreme cost, and their numbers dwindled with each passing sortie. The battle for Leyte Gulf marked the last large-scale attempt by Japan to reverse the strategic tide through coordinated naval action. In the air above that sprawling confrontation, Hellcats enforced a new reality. The offensive capacity of Japanese naval aviation could no longer be sustained against integrated radar control, disciplined tactics, and industrially backed fighter strength. Overwhelming force replaced uncertainty, and with it came the erosion of Japan's remaining strategic options in the Pacific. Okinawa's air battles, crushing resistance in Japan's defensive perimeter. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had compressed toward Japan's inner defensive ring. The island of Okinawa lay just hundreds of miles from the Japanese home islands, making it a strategic stepping stone for invasion planners and a final shield for Tokyo. The campaign that unfolded around it, the Battle of Okinawa, became one of the most ferocious combined air and naval battles of the war. Above the fleet supporting the landings, the Grumman F6F Hellcat operated in a sky saturated with desperation. Unlike earlier carrier engagements defined by organized air groups, Okinawa's air war was characterized by relentless waves of mixed threats. Conventional fighters, aging bombers, and large-scale kamikaze formations approached from multiple directions, often coordinated with weather patterns to obscure detection. Japanese strategy no longer centered on preserving aircraft or pilots for future operations. The objective was attritional disruption, damage enough ships to make the invasion untenable. Hellcat squadrons were tasked with maintaining near-constant combat, air patrols over the fleet. Radar picket destroyers stationed far from the main carrier groups served as forward warning nodes, detecting incoming raids and vectoring fighters toward projected interception points. These picket ships absorbed enormous risk. They were prime targets for kamikaze strikes, and their survival often depended on how quickly Hellcats could intercept approaching attackers. Combat over Okinawa was not defined by isolated duels, but by volume and persistence. Pilots might intercept one formation only to be redirected toward another minutes later. Fuel calculations became critical, as extended patrol time reduced margin for diversion or pursuit. Ammunition discipline mattered as well. Expending too much firepower on a single target risked facing subsequent attackers with depleted guns. The Hellcat's durability remained a key advantage. Encounters with kamikaze aircraft often required close-range bursts aimed at engines or cockpit areas to ensure immediate loss of control. Even when under return fire, the Hellcat's armor and self-sealing tanks provided survivability that earlier American fighters had lacked. Yet, durability did not eliminate danger. Fragments from exploding aircraft or near misses could damage control surfaces, forcing emergency recoveries to carrier decks crowded with activity. Japanese conventional fighter opposition at Okinawa was diminished compared to earlier campaigns, but it was not absent. Some experienced pilots remained, and land-based aircraft operating from Kyushu staged coordinated sorties. These engagements demonstrated that air superiority did not equate to invulnerability. Hellcat pilots still faced anti-aircraft fire from coastal batteries and the ever-present risk of mechanical failure over open water. Operational tempo during Okinawa reached sustained intensity rarely seen before. Sortie rates were high, and fatigue accumulated across squadrons. Pilots often launched before dawn and recovered after sunset, navigating complex landing patterns aboard carriers maneuvering to avoid attack. Deck crews worked continuously to refuel and rearm aircraft, knowing that the next radar contact could signal another inbound wave. The attritional effect on Japanese air assets was severe. Aircraft losses mounted with each failed attempt to penetrate the defensive screen. Replacement pilots, often minimally trained, confronted radar-directed interceptions and disciplined formations that limited opportunities for surprise. The Hellcat's role evolved into enforcement, denying Japanese aircraft the ability to operate freely within what had once been considered a defensive perimeter. Okinawa's air battles underscored the transformation of Pacific air power since 1942. What had begun as a contest of maneuver and tactical improvisation matured into a system defined by integration, radar detection, fighter direction, industrial supply, and coordinated fleet defense. The Hellcat operated as part of that system, amplifying its effectiveness through reliability and firepower. By the time the Okinawa campaign concluded, Japan's capacity to contest airspace near its home islands had been sharply curtailed. Resistance persisted, and attacks remained lethal, but the balance was unmistakable. The skies above Okinawa reflected a culmination of accumulated advantages. In that final defensive perimeter, the Hellcat did not merely engage opposition. It enforced a dominance built through sustained adaptation and relentless operational pressure.